Chapter 18. Modern Conveniences. Mrs. Brocket paced the drawing room with mounting agitation, her heels clicking against the worn floorboards in a staccato rhythm of displeasure. "Mabel!" she shrieked, her voice piercing through the musty air. "Where is that insufferable girl?" "I ain't deaf, am I?" Mabel materialised in the doorway, a feather duster hanging limply in her hand. "Been here the whole time, haven't I?" "Do not speak to me in that vulgar manner." Mrs. Brocket's nostrils flared. "Mr. Pompington will be arriving shortly, and this house is in a state of absolute debasement. I demand you make it look—" She waved her hand in the air, searching for the appropriate word. "More affluential." Isabella, sprawled across a faded chaise longue, rolled her eyes. Mrs. Brocket turned to Mabel. "Now, ensure the dining room is immaculate. Mr. Pompington is a gentleman of considerable means, and I will not have him thinking we live like common folk." "Right then," Mabel muttered. "I'll just wave me magic wand and turn this pile of old rubbish into Buckingham Palace, shall I?" "What was that?" "Nothing, Mrs. Brocket. Just saying how I'll do me best." Marianne bounced into the room, her face alight with enthusiasm. "Oh, Mother! I've just been practicing my conversation topics for dinner. Would Mr. Pompington be interested in hearing about how I once saw a cat that looked exactly like a piece of toast?" Mrs. Brocket closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. "Marianne, dear, perhaps you could assist Catherine in selecting an appropriate gown for this evening instead." Catherine, who had been scribbling furiously in her journal by the window, looked up. "I've already chosen my dress, Mother, the pink one with the—" "Not that ghastly thing," Mrs. Brocket interrupted. "It makes you look like an overripe strawberry. Wear the blue one." "But, Mother—" "The blue one, Catherine. We must present ourselves as a family of refinement and—" She paused again, searching for another impressive word. "Intellectual sustenance." Isabella snorted. "Sustenance? Really, Mother?" "Yes, sustenance. Mr. Pompington is known for his appreciation of sustenance in all its forms." Mrs. Brocket straightened her already rigid posture. "Now, where is your father?" "In his study," Isabella replied, "probably hiding from all this nonsense." "Nonsense? This evening could secure one of you girls a most advantageous match. Mr. Pompington probably owns half of Greater Mudbury." "Which half?" Marianne asked earnestly. "The top or the bottom?" Mrs. Brocket ignored her middle daughter and turned her attention back to the increasingly dire state of the drawing room. "Mabel, these cushions are completely askew. And what is that peculiar odour?" "That'll be the new plumbing you had me install last month," Mabel replied, half-heartedly prodding at a cushion. "Told you it weren't a good idea, didn't I?" "Nonsense! Modern conveniences are essential for a family of our standing. Now go and ensure the dining room is properly illuminated. We must create an atmosphere of—" She gestured vaguely. "Aristocratical superiority." "That's not a word," Isabella muttered under her breath. "And girls," Mrs. Brocket continued, her voice taking on a threatening edge, "I expect you all to be on your absolute best behaviour. No mention of cats or toast or whatever other peculiar thoughts might enter your heads. We shall discuss only the most refined topics, the weather, the latest fashions from London, and the deplorable state of other people's marriages. And Mabel, you'll make this house worthy of Mr. Pompington's presence, or I shall have you cleaning the chimneys with your toothbrush." As Mabel shuffled away, muttering what were undoubtedly choice words under her breath, Mrs. Brocket turned to her daughters with a look of grim determination. "Remember, girls, this evening must be perfect. Perfect. Now go and make yourselves presentable. And Marianne, do try to keep your mouth closed unless specifically addressed. We cannot risk any unexpected contributions to the conversation. Like that time I told Lady Uppington about the ghost living in our water closet? Marianne asked brightly. Precisely like that, Mrs. Brockett replied through gritted teeth. Now, off you go, all of you. I must ensure the dining room meets my exacting standards of— She paused one final time, searching for the perfect word— magnificential splendour. As her daughters departed, Mrs. Brockett stood in the centre of the drawing-room, surveying her domain with the air of a general preparing for battle. The worn furniture, the slightly crooked paintings, the mysterious stain on the ceiling, all of it would have to be overcome. Mr. Pompington would be impressed, one of her daughters would be married, and her social standing would rise accordingly. Nothing, absolutely nothing, would be allowed to interfere with her plans. A little while later, Mr. Pompington's arrival was announced by Mabel's distinctly unenthusiastic voice. "Some fancy gentleman here to see you, Mrs. Brockett." Mr. Pompington swept into the dining room with an air of self-importance that nearly rivaled Mrs. Brockett's own. He was a corpulent man, with mutton chops and a waistcoat that strained against its buttons. "How utterly delightful to make your acquaintance." Mrs. Brockett simpered, ushering him to the head of the table. "We are most honoured by your prestigious—" A faint drip from above caught her eye. "Presents!" she finished with unexpected volume, causing Mr. Pompington to start. "Yes, well," he adjusted his cravat. "One must occasionally venture beyond Greater Mudbury to observe how the other half lives." Mrs. Brockett positioned Isabella directly across from their guest, while Marianne and Catherine were strategically placed further away. Mr. Brockett had been relegated to the far end of the table, where he sat with an expression of mild amusement. "Mabel, the soup!" Mrs. Brockett commanded, noticing another threatening drip forming on the ceiling, the stain appearing to darken. "And do hurry with it!" As Mabel served the soup with her usual lack of grace, Mrs. Brockett launched into her carefully prepared conversation. "Mr. Pompington, I understand you are most learned in the subject of—" She spotted a brown droplet descending towards his bowl. "Classical architecture!" Mr. Pompington blinked at her sudden shift in volume. "Indeed, madam. In fact, Isabella!" Mrs. Brockett interrupted, watching in horror as another drop fell. "Do tell Mr. Pompington about your fascination with Ionic columns." Isabella, who had no such fascination, raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid columns leave me rather cold, mother." A distinct plop sound came from Mr. Pompington's soup bowl. He frowned, stirring it suspiciously. "Is there perhaps some pepper in this?" "Yes!" Mrs. Brockett practically leapt from her chair. "Exotic pepper from India." She began waving her napkin in an elaborate fashion, ostensibly to waft the pepper's aroma, but actually to distract from the increasingly frequent drips. "Mother," Marianne piped up, "is this like the time you said that mouse dropping in the pudding was a rare French raisin?" "Marianne!" Mrs. Brockett's voice reached new heights. "Perhaps you'd like to dance?" "Now?" Marianne asked, bewildered. "Yes, a spontaneous display of accomplishment." Mrs. Brockett began humming frantically as another drop fell dangerously close to Mr. Pompington's bowl. "Most irregular," Mr. Pompington muttered, but his attention was drawn to Isabella. "Young lady, what are your thoughts on the current fashion for—" "Poetry," Mrs. Brockett interjected, practically throwing herself across the table to block his view of a particularly large drip. "Catherine, recite that lovely verse about—" "The The one about the dying swan, Catherine offered helpfully. No, something less liquid. Mrs. Brocket was now performing what appeared to be an elaborate seated ballet, ducking and weaving to intercept drops with her own napkin. Mr. Brocket, from his safe position at the far end, merely sipped his wine and observed the unfolding chaos with quiet satisfaction. "Mrs. Brocket," Mr. Pompington said, "are you quite well? You seem rather passionate about culture," she finished for him, while simultaneously attempting to create a makeshift canopy with her shawl above his head. "It often overwhelms me with hysteria," Isabella suggested. "Enthusiasm," Mrs. Brocket corrected through clenched teeth. "Mabel, clear the soup, quickly." "Right you are," Mabel drawled, taking her time. "Though them brown spots add a certain something to the look, don't they?" Mr. Pompington frowned at his bowl. "Now that you mention it, there is a rather unusual pattern." "Patterns!" Mrs. Brocket cried, knocking over her wine-glass in her haste to distract him. "How fascinating they are! The patterns of society, of nature, of sewage dripping from the ceiling," Isabella finished innocently. Mrs. Brocket's laugh was slightly maniacal. "My eldest has such a vivid imagination. Now, Mr. Pompington, shall we move on to the main course? Mabel has prepared a most elegant dish of—" A large drop landed squarely in the remains of his soup with an audible splash. We're moving to the other end of the table for a change of perspective," Mr. Brocket offered, speaking for the first time with barely concealed mirth. "Precisely!" Mrs. Brocket began herding their bewildered guest to a slightly less compromised section of the table. "One must always seek fresh perspectives in life, don't you agree? Particularly when one is considering the possibility of advantageous social connections through the holy institution of—" Another ominous gurgle from above cut her off mid-matchmaking. "Matrimony!" Mrs. Brocket finished with a flourish as Mabel trudged in with the main course. "Peculiar acoustics in this room," Mr. Pompington observed, settling into his new position. "And is that a rather distinctive aroma I detect?" "Lavender!" Mrs. Brocket practically shouted. "We've had the house thoroughly scented with smells more like the back end of a—" Mabel began. "Lovely herbs!" Mrs. Brocket cut her off. "Isabella, do tell Mr. Pompington about your interest in botany." "I have no interest in botany," Isabella replied flatly, watching a brown droplet form directly above Mr. Pompington's fresh plate of mutton. Mrs. Brocket's eye twitched. "Catherine, your embroidery! Show Mr. Pompington your—" She lunged across the table, narrowly intercepting a drop with her sleeve. "Needlework!" "But, Mother, my embroidery is upstairs," Catherine protested. "Then describe it!" Mrs. Brocket was now performing what appeared to be an elaborate seated quadrille, bobbing and weaving to protect their guest from the ceiling's increasingly frequent contributions to dinner. "Well," Catherine began uncertainly, "I'm working on a scene of—" "Birds!" Mrs. Brocket interrupted, spotting another threatening drip. "Flying birds! Nothing to do with water or— Actually, it's a fountain," Catherine corrected. Mr. Pompington raised his fork to his mouth just as Mrs. Brocket noticed an especially large drop forming above. "Marianne!" she shrieked. "Show us your new dance steps!" Marianne, who had been contemplating whether clouds ever got lonely, jumped up enthusiastically. "Oh, yes, I've invented a new one called the Startled Goose in a Thunderstorm." "Perfect!" Mrs. Brocket manoeuvred herself to block Mr. Pompington's view of the ceiling. "Mr. Pompington, you simply must watch this cultural display." As Marianne began flapping and squawking around the room, Mr. Pompington's attention was successfully diverted from both his plate and the increasingly dire situation above. "Most unusual," he commented, watching Marianne's performance with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Is this a common dance in Lesser Mudbury?" "Oh, no," Marianne replied mid-flap. "I was inspired by watching our neighbour's goose get struck by—" "Lightning!" Mrs. Brocket interjected. "Such a dramatic art form. Isabella, perhaps you'd care to join your sister in this... I would rather drink from the chamber pot," Isabella replied calmly. Mr. Brocket, still safely ensconced at his end of the table, raised his wine-glass in quiet approval of his eldest daughter's candour. A particularly loud gurgle from above caused Mrs. Brocket to spring into action once again. "Mr. Pompington, you simply must tell us about your extensive property holdings in Greater Mudbury. I understand you own several very distinguished—" She dived across the table, napkin outstretched like a sail. "Buildings." "Indeed," he replied, increasingly puzzled by her athletic displays. "Though I must say, Mrs. Brocket, your behaviour seems rather enthusiastic," she finished for him, now practically sprawled across the dining table. "One cannot help but be enthusiastic when in the presence of such a distinguished—" Another drop splashed onto the tablecloth, mere inches from his plate. "Gentlemen!" "Mother!" Isabella drawled. "In your enthusiasm to protect Mr. Pompington's plate, you've managed to dip your hair in his mutton sauce." Mrs. Brocket straightened up, the sauce indeed dripping from her carefully arranged coiffure. "Merely a new French fashion," she declared with desperate dignity. "All the finest ladies in Paris are wearing their dinner this season. Isn't that right, Mr. Brocket?" "Oh, undoubtedly," Mr. Brocket replied, helping himself to more wine. "Though I believe they typically wait until after the meal to begin wearing it." The ceiling emitted another threatening gurgle. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brocket screeched. "Clear these plates and bring the dessert with great haste and urgency?" Isabella suggested, before the ceiling completely collapses into a celebration of... Mrs. Brocket floundered. "Sewage?" Marianne offered helpfully, still mid-goose dance. "Sophistication!" Mrs. Brocket's voice had reached a pitch previously unknown to human ears. "Mr. Pompington, I don't suppose you've given any thought to the advantages of marrying into a family of such obvious... A large brown stain was now spreading across the ceiling like a sinister ink blot. "Refinement?" Mr. Pompington suggested, finally noticing the direction of her increasingly frantic glances. "Mrs. Brocket, is there perhaps something amiss with your—" "Architecture!" she shrieked, throwing her shawl over his head like a makeshift tent. "The house is simply overflowing with... That ain't the only thing that's overflowing," Mabel muttered as she shuffled out to fetch the dessert. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brocket hissed, yanking her maid into the hallway with surprising force. "A word!" "Ain't got time for words," Mabel replied, attempting to free herself from Mrs. Brocket's iron grip. "Got to serve the dessert, haven't I?" "Never mind the dessert." Mrs. Brocket's voice was a furious whisper. "What have you done to the plumbing system I ordered you to install?" "What I done?" Mabel's indignation rose. I told you right from the start, didn't I? Said to you, Mrs. Brockett, I said, I ain't no plumber, don't know nothing about pipes and such. But, oh no, you wouldn't listen, would you? You assured me you could handle it. I did nothing of the sort. Said it was a bad idea, connecting all them pipes to the water closet. But you were certain, weren't you? Make us modern, you says. Like them fancy houses in London, you says. Mrs. Brocket's face contorted with rage. I specifically instructed you to create a system of sophisticated, of elegant, of what? Sewage? Mabel snorted. Ain't nothing sophisticated about it, is there? Just a bunch of pipes held together with string and hope. That's what it is. A distant gurgle emphasized her point. Fix it, Mrs. Brockett demanded. Go upstairs this instant and do whatever needs to be done. With what? Ain't got no proper tools, have I? Just that old box of rusty whatnots you found in the garden shed. Then use those. Use anything. I don't care if you have to employ black magic. Just prevent any more of that matter from disrupting my dinner party. Mabel crossed her arms. Thought you said last week that fixing pipes wasn't part of my duties. Said it was beneath my station as a lady's maid, you did. That was before you allowed sewage to rain down upon my distinguished guest. Distinguished, is he? Mabel's eyes narrowed. That the same distinguished gentleman what got caught behind the tavern with Enough! Mrs. Brocket's whisper became a strangled screech. Upstairs, now, and take that deplorable toolbox with you. From the dining room came Marianne's cheerful voice. Oh, look! The brown spots on the ceiling are making a pattern that looks exactly like Lady Uppington's face. Mrs. Brockett closed her eyes in pain. Go! She commanded through gritted teeth. Fix it, or I shall have you cleaning chamber pots with your own bonnet for the next month. Muttering darkly under her breath, Mabel stomped up the stairs, toolbox clanking ominously with each step. Right then, she grumbled, reaching the upper floor. Let's see what we can do with this load of old rubbish. She approached the source of the problem. A complex network of poorly connected pipes that looked more like a drunken spider's web than any proper plumbing system. Armed with nothing but rusty tools and questionable determination, Mabel began her work. Suppose this bit goes here, she muttered, forcing two pipes together with a piece of frayed rope. And this wobbly thing might do better if I just... She gave a stubborn joint a solid whack with what might have once been a hammer. The pipes responded with an ominous groan. Oh, shut your moaning, Mabel told them, applying more rope to a suspicious-looking join. You ain't half as unhappy as I am about this arrangement. From below came the sound of Mrs. Brocket's voice, still attempting to maintain control of her dinner party. What excellent weather we're having! Mabel rolled her eyes and continued her dubious repairs. She wrapped an old rag around a leaking section, wedged a piece of wood under a sagging pipe, and applied liberal amounts of what she hoped was sealing wax to anything that looked threatening. The entire system shuddered. Now don't you go getting any ideas, she warned the pipes, giving them another experimental tap. Just hold together for 1 more hour, that's all I'm asking. Then you can fall to pieces all you like. The pipes made a sound that suggested they had other plans. Fine, Mabel conceded, stepping back to survey her handiwork. Be that way, but don't say I didn't try to reason with you. From downstairs came Mrs. Brocket's voice again. Mabel! The dessert! Can't be in 2 places at once, can I? Mabel shouted back. She gave the pipes one final suspicious look. Right then, you lot behave yourselves while I'm gone. Though, she added with a slight smirk. If you was to wait until just the right moment to make your grand statement, who am I to stop you? The pipes gurgled what sounded suspiciously like agreement. Come in, Mabel called, descending the stairs with deliberate slowness. She entered the dining room bearing a trifle that listed dangerously to one side, much like the house's plumbing system. Finally! Mrs. Brocket's smile was now permanently fixed in a rictus of desperation. Mr. Pompington was just telling us about his extensive collection of... A thunderous crack from above drowned out whatever Mr. Pompington collected. Dessert spoons! Mrs. Brocket shrieked, practically throwing bowls of trifle at her guests. Everyone must eat immediately, with great haste, suggested Isabella, watching the ceiling bulge ominously. Enthusiasm, Mrs. Brocket corrected, her voice reaching a pitch that made the crystal glasses vibrate. Mr. Pompington, you simply must try this exceptional, The ceiling gave an almighty groan. Recipe! She lurched forward, attempting to shield him with her own body. It's been in our family for generations of proper plumbing, Mabel muttered from her position by the door. A large chunk of plaster detached itself from the ceiling and landed with impressive accuracy in Catherine's trifle. Oh! Marianne exclaimed brightly. It's just like that time we found a dead mouse in the Christmas pudding, isn't it? Though this piece looks more like a architectural feature. Mrs. Brocket's voice could have shattered windows. Mr. Pompington, as a man of property, you must appreciate the unique... The entire ceiling seemed to sag downward. Mrs. Brocket stood up, spreading her arms wide as if to physically hold the ceiling in place. With a sound like the last gasp of a dying whale, the ceiling finally gave way. The entire jury-rigged plumbing system, complete with pipes, water closet, and various unspeakable contents, crashed through in spectacular fashion, landing squarely in the middle of the dining table. For one eternal moment, silence reigned. Then Mr. Pompington spoke. Mrs. Brocket, he said with remarkable composure, given that he was now sharing space with a toilet, I believe there may be some irregularities with your plumbing arrangements. Merely a modern innovation, Mrs. Brocket declared, brushing plaster from her shoulders with desperate dignity. All the finest homes in London are having their facilities join them for dinner these days. Isn't that right, Mr. Brocket? Oh, indeed, Mr. Brocket replied, calmly sipping his wine. Though most families prefer to issue a formal invitation first. Well, said Marianne thoughtfully. At least it's not as bad as the time Mabel's attempt at building a greenhouse collapsed during Lady Uppington's tea party. Remember how that cucumber frame nearly... Mabel! Mrs. Brocket's screech could have wakened the dead. Clear this architectural enhancement away at once. Right you are, Mabel replied, making no move to approach the disaster. Though it adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the room, don't it? Mr. Pompington stood up, carefully extracting his coat from a puddle of questionable origin. Mrs. Brocket, while I appreciate your innovative approach to dining entertainment, I feel I must... No! Mrs. Brocket lunged forward, nearly impaling herself on a broken pipe. You haven't yet heard about my daughter's many accomplishments. Isabella is exceptionally skilled at avoiding marriage, Isabella suggested helpfully. Conversation, Mrs. Brocket ploughed on, now standing ankle-deep in debris. And Marianne is particularly gifted in attracting disasters, offered Mr. Brocket. Social grace. Mrs. Brocket was now clutching at Mr. Pompington's sleeve with the desperation of a drowning woman. And Catherine! Catherine has such a wonderful way with— Mother, Catherine interrupted gently, I believe Mr. Pompington's cravat is dripping. Indeed, the gentleman's neckwear had fallen victim to a vindictive leak from one of the surviving pipes. I really must insist on taking my leave, Mr. Pompington said sharply, attempting to disentangle himself from Mrs. Brocket's grip. This evening has been most enlightening. Mrs. Brocket refused to release him. Why, we haven't even discussed the possibility of an advantageous alliance between our families. Surely a man of your standing can appreciate the unique domestic innovations, suggested Isabella dryly. Qualities. Mrs. Brocket's voice had achieved a pitch previously known only to bats. That our family possesses. Mr. Pompington finally succeeded in freeing himself. Madam, he said, with the air of a man choosing his words very carefully, while your evening has certainly been memorable, I fear I must decline any further association with your household. The standards of hygiene in Lesser Mudbury are clearly not up to Greater Mudbury's exacting requirements. But, Mrs. Brocket began. Good evening to you all, he continued, backing towards the door, though I suggest you might want to consider relocating your water closet to a more traditional position. With that, he fled, leaving only a trail of sludgy footprints to mark his passage. Mrs. Brocket stood amid the ruins of her dinner party, surrounded by broken pipes, scattered plaster and ceramic, and the remains of what had once been a trifle. Her face underwent a fascinating series of transformations before settling on apocalyptic rage. Mabel, she roared, this is entirely your fault. You will clean this mess immediately, and then you will repair the ceiling. And for heaven's sake, learn from your mistakes. Begging your pardon, Mabel interrupted. But wasn't it you what insisted on having modern conveniences installed by someone what told you they didn't know nothing about plumbing just to save a few shillings? Silence! Mrs. Brocket turned to her daughters. And you three, if you don't improve your behaviour immediately, you'll be helping Mabel with the repairs. Actually, said Isabella, rising from her chair, I think I'd rather enjoy learning about plumbing. It seems far more interesting than attempting to secure a husband through architectural disasters. How dare you! Mr. Brocket, say something! Mr. Brocket carefully set down his wineglass. I believe, he said mildly, that everything that needs to be said has been said by our plumbing system. Most eloquently, too. Mrs. Brocket let out a screech of pure frustration and stormed from the room, leaving devastation in her wake. Well, said Marianne brightly, at least this wasn't as bad as the time she tried to have me teach the vicar's wife's parrot to recite Shakespeare. Did I ever tell you about how it escaped and started shouting, "Out, damned Spot!" at Lady Uppington's prize-winning roses? Mabel surveyed the chaos with philosophical resignation. Suppose I'd better start cleaning up then, though them pipes made their feelings about the evening pretty clear, didn't they? Above them, through the newly created skylight, a final pipe gave a satisfied gurgle of agreement.